Today I'm going to show you how to make an amazing pull-apart garlic bread. This loaf has got a great chewy crust with soft layers that trap in all that garlic, butter and cheese, and this technique is great for introducing many different fillings into your dough, not just garlic and cheese. So in our bowl we're going to add 288 grams of milk. This has got a fat content of 3.5%. We're going to sprinkle on 8 grams of instant dried yeast. Now if you prefer to activate your yeast first, then you can do this by adding some of the milk and the yeast in a separate bowl first. I'm going to follow up with 412 grams of strong white bread flour, 8 grams of sea salt and 10 grams of barley malt extract. This one's in syrup form. Now, if you don't have barley malt extract, you could sub it for honey, molasses or sugar, or you could leave it out completely. Now, the full recipe will be linked in the description and that's going to include substitutions as well. We're going to mix everything into a rough dough. Don't worry about getting it smooth at this stage. Just make sure the ingredients are well combined and there aren't any dry clumps. Add 15 grams of butter to the top of the dough, cover it and leave it to rest for 20 minutes at room temperature. Now I'm using 8 grams of yeast because my kitchen's quite cool today and I want to speed the process up a little bit. But there is a trade-off. The dough won't develop quite as much flavour and it's going to have a bit more of a commercial yeast flavour. Now, neither of these are going to matter with this loaf because it's all about the garlic, butter and the texture of the bread. But if you do want to reduce the yeast down to 4 grams, you can. Just remember that everything's going to take a bit longer depending on the temperature in your kitchen. Now after a 20-minute rest, we can turn the dough out onto our bench, fold the butter into the center and then give it a good knead. Now if we were using a higher quantity of fat and I needed to develop more strength into this dough, I would add the fat later in the process. But for this recipe, it's fine to add it at this stage. We're going to keep working this dough until all of the butter is well incorporated. So this is a 70% hydration dough, but as we're using milk instead of water, the dough is going to be a bit firmer. It's a really nice and easy dough to work with. Once the dough is nice and smooth, you can shape it into a ball, pop it back into your bowl, cover it and leave it out at room temperature to bulk ferment. Now my kitchen's 18 degrees Celsius today and this dough took 3 hours to prove, and now I can turn it out onto the work surface ready to shape. Now the dough needs to be rolled out into a rectangle that's roughly 50 centimeters by 30 centimeters, but don't overly stress about the size of the dough that you're rolling out. Think of it like this: the larger the rectangle, the more layers your bread's going to have. The smaller the rectangle, the less layers, so nothing serious to stress over. Now if your dough tightens up during the rolling, don't panic, just cover it, leave it with a cloth and just let it rest for 5 minutes and then come back and continue. My tin is 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters by 19 centimeters. The quantity of dough, garlic butter and cheese work perfectly for this size tin, but I'll have directions on how to scale this recipe based on your tin size in that recipe that's linked in the description. I made this garlic butter by melting the butter and then adding fresh grated garlic to it. I left it to infuse on an extremely low heat, like 1 out of 9 on my stove, and I left it for 5 minutes. Then I let the butter cool down and solidify a little, but not go completely hard. Brush the garlic mixture onto the dough, trying to get a relatively even coverage. Now this size dough takes about 70 grams of butter and 6 large cloves of garlic. Sprinkle on 200 grams of grated cheese. Now I'm using a blend of low moisture mozzarella and Gouda. We're going to finish this off with a quick twist of salt and black pepper. Although my tins are non-stick, I always give them a quick coating of vegetable oil just to make sure. Cut the dough into strips, stack each one on top of the other. Then we're going to cut those strips down into squares. Now the size of the square is going to depend on the size of your tin. You can see here I've cut them smaller to give the dough a chance to prove in that tin. Now laying your tin on its end while you stack the dough inside makes this process a lot easier. Once done, just even everything out a touch, cover the dough and leave it out at room temperature to prove. Now my oven is set to bake mode with the fan turned off. It's been preheated to 175 degrees Celsius or 350 degrees Fahrenheit with a baking stone placed on the lower third shelf. You don't need to use a baking stone for this bake, but it does help. The extra boost of heat will help the loaf cook through before we get too much colour on the top of this loaf. During the bake, I will place an upturned baking tray between the top of the loaf and the heating element. As we're using fat and cheese in this recipe, I will use the tray to protect the top of the loaf from the direct heat, and that's going to control the amount of colour. The dough took 2 hours to prove at my kitchen temperature, and please make sure you aren't tempted to bake this too quick. Let the dough prove properly. You can see how much mine has risen compared to before. Slide the loaf into the oven and bake for 40 minutes. If your loaf needs a little bit of extra colour towards the end of the bake, you can remove the upturned baking tray. Let the loaf cool on a wire rack, but not completely. This is definitely one to eat warm. The crust on this loaf is crispy, the crumb beautifully soft with the garlic, butter and cheese glistening between the layers. And if you want to have a go at baking a really soft sourdough sandwich loaf, then have a look at this video here. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'll see you again very soon. Stay tuned.